Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year, in case I haven't said it to you yet. This is day 11 of the 12 Days of Celtic Mythology. So we've been working our way through a story called The Adventures of Art, Son of Conn in this series. Every day I tell a piece of the story and then see where it takes us for a wider discussion of Celtic mythology. So I've put some links where you can read the story or hear me telling it all in one go in the description below the video, in case you find that helpful. And there's also a link there which says catch up, which will take you to the whole playlist of the 12 days. I really appreciate your donations on Ko-fi, and a big thank you to the people who donated or become patrons since I started the series. The money's a big help. And it's also nice just to know people value my work, so thank you. We're nearing the end of the story, and so doing the daily synopsis is getting a bit mad. For today, let's just say that Art's on a quest to find a woman called Delvkive. He's risked drowning, he's been seduced, he's hacked his way through all kinds of monsters, and as we join him, he can actually see her off in the distance. As Art gazed up at the beautiful Delvkive in her tower, he wondered about the mysterious Morgan the magician, and about Delvkive's mother, Doghead, daughter of the queen of the Dogheads. Little did he know that it was Doghead herself who had put the hags and giants and every evil thing between him and the woman he was seeking. For the druids had foretold to her that if ever a suitor reached Delvkive in her tower, then Doghead's own life would be at an end. Art saw a stately palace before him, surrounded by a palisade of bronze, and as he looked up at Delvkive's tower, she looked down and saw him. "A suitor is approaching," said Delvkive to her maidens, "fairer than any who has come before, and I know that this is Art, son of Conn. Take care to bring him to my bower, lest my mother kill him like all the others." The maidens secretly fetched Art to Delvkive's tower. But just as Creja had said, 2 women now came forward, offering Art cups of welcome. He was careful to choose only the cup on the right. Immediately, Doghead called him out to do battle. She was the most formidable warrior Art had ever encountered. She was dressed from head to toe in shining armor. She came toward him brandishing a sword in each hand. They crossed and recrossed the courtyard with Art narrowly defending himself, but he could gain no advantage. She harried him along the ramparts of the castle, threatening to overthrow him, but Art was too nimble for that. On and on they fought until finally Doghead grew careless, and Art saw his one chance, and taking an almighty swing with his sword, he cut the head from her and thrust it onto the one vacant spike on the palisade. Triumphant, Art climbed the stairs to Delvkive's tower, and she welcomed him with all her heart and embraced him and kissed him, and they spent a merry night together. But in the morning, just when all seemed well, Morgan the magician appeared, and he too called Art to a duel. Tired though he was, Art had little choice but to dress himself for battle. He stood before Morgan in a mantle of white satin with an apron of burnished gold around his waist. He wore a fine helmet of red gold and carried a fair purple embossed shield on his back. He buckled on his wide grooved sword of blue steel and carried 2 spears, thick shafted and tipped with bronze, and they fell to fighting. It was a different kind of fight, however, for as well as sword play, Morgan used magic against Art so that he hardly knew where his opponent was. Morgan would be before him one moment and behind him the next, and then Morgan caught sight of the head of his wife on the spike where Art had put it. He grew angry, and with that anger, he grew reckless, and once again, the victory was with Art. Whew. I think I deserve a cup of tea. So there's still one chapter to the story, which I'll tell tomorrow. But did Art look fabulous in his fighting attire? It's a bit more stylish than camo, you have to admit. So sometimes when I tell this part of the story, I add a little line that I stole from James Stevens' retelling. So this is how James Stevens adds a little something to the scene where Art and Morgan the magician are fighting. And Morgan has seen the head of the wife on the spike. And James Stevens puts a little thought into Morgan the magician's head. He says, but when the wife's time has come, the husband is doomed. He's required elsewhere by his beloved, and Morgan went to rejoin his queen in the world that comes after the many-colored land. So the many-colored land is the phrase Stevens is using for the other world here. So Stevens is pointing to something very profound here, and it shows that he has a deep understanding of the myth. Because if you think about this, Stevens is pointing us right back to the start of the story. Remember that as the story began, Con was sitting on his dead wife's grave mound. He felt that he was no longer fit to govern, and it's not easy for the old to let go. Something I'm beginning to understand myself. We feel like if you just take a bit more exercise and get the supplements right, we can be 40 forever. And if that doesn't work, well, maybe a new young partner will put a spring in our step. But life and power and kingship are cyclical. So just as surely as the seasons are cyclical, the wheel of the year turns and the wheel of kingship also turns. One way or another, spring will always overcome winter. And in those times when winter hangs on to power, the land and the people suffer. In the paradigm of kingship, which we find in Celtic myth, a king without a queen is in a perilous and untenable position because one way or another, she bestows sovereignty. So it's no wonder that Con sees a potential wife in Becuma, but his timing is off. It's too late for him. If you're enjoying this series, why not take one of my online classes? There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay what you can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter or follow me on my Patreon page. So Celtic Studies is a funny old game. You read a myth and you burn up your brain cells trying to find the meaning. The more you read and study, the better chance you have of understanding it, of course. And then you think, aha, I see what this story is about. And you feel like you've made a great discovery. And then you stumble onto a paper written 40 years ago, or sometimes 100 years ago, and you realize that you weren't the first to make the big discovery at all. But it is really nice to know that at least one person with a doctorate agrees with what you figured out all by yourself. So if you want to understand Celtic mythology, your own brain can take you a certain distance, but you can also waste a lot of time reinventing the wheel. I've placed a lot of emphasis in this series on going slowly and making you think about the story. But you've also had me for a guide, even if I'm not the best guide there could be. I don't recommend that you run out and read a commentary on a myth before you read it. Your first impressions and the emotional impact and imagery are important. But on the other hand, if you want to understand Celtic myth more generally, you probably either need a teacher or you need to read a lot of books and scholarly papers on JSTOR, something like that. Otherwise, your understanding is likely to stay at the superficial level of adventure and romance, and you'll miss what's going on under the surface. So that was a bit of a digression. But let's see what Brendan O'Hare has to say about this story in, I think, just about the only paper that's been written about the adventures of Art. Now, there are two guys called Brendan O'Hare. There's a famous Irish author. This isn't him. This man is obviously also Irish, but he was a professor of some kind of literary studies at Berkeley in California. He certainly agrees that it's a sovereignty story, and Becuma is a sovereignty figure. And he also has this to say about the famine, which is interesting. So he says prosperity, defined as abundant produce, depends upon the king's being in favor with the goddess of the land. When the queen dies, common sense says her blessing has been withdrawn. If the king were to attempt to hold on to the kingship, the crops would certainly fail. So remember way back in day, maybe 1 or something, I talked a bit about kings and how their way of living, their right action or wrong action affected the prosperity of the kingdom. They needed to be perfect and all of that. So O'Hare thinks that according to the rules of sovereignty, as long as Con remains king, famine is inevitable. So he's saying with the death of his first queen, her blessing was withdrawn, and perhaps because of Con's age, if the king were to attempt to hold on to the kingship, the crops would certainly fail. So perhaps Con's druids or the storyteller have it wrong. Maybe the problem isn't Becuma at all. And then he continues to explore this idea. And he says, but what if, sounds like me, as must sometimes happen, king and queen are both alive and well and living in amicable union. So everything's fine, in other words. Yet the crops nonetheless fail. Ooh. The theological solution, and he's not talking about Christian theology here, he's talking about the theology within which this paradigm sits. The theological solution would be to recognize that the queen is not the queen, but a substituted imposter. Well, that would certainly fit the Becuma picture. What he's suggesting here is the queen would always be blamed for things going wrong, but I don't agree with that. There are too many references in myth and early law to the importance of the perfection of the king and how if he's blemished or he behaves badly or is just past his sell-by date, the land will suffer. However, I think O'Hare nails it better when he offers another idea. He says, similarly, although the moral criticism directed at Becuma's adultery, corruption, and infidelity belongs totally to a Christian culture, in an earlier version of the story, she could still have been adjudged metaphysically or operatively evil. In other words, there's just something tainted about her. She's the wrong wife for Con, so she causes the crops to fail. And I think this is the crux of it. And the reason she's the wrong wife for Con is because he doesn't need a queen. He just needs to go. So I don't know if you noticed it, but in today's bit of the story, there's a nice bit of parallelism. Delphkive's mother, Doghead, doesn't want her daughter to be courted because there's a prophecy which says she'll die when her daughter is courted. And I'm sure we all know what courted is a euphemism for. I'm not sure that every part of our picture of Delphkive's life is an original part of the story, but it's a nice bit of storytelling. And perhaps in a way, it's true for Con too. When his son marries, then his son will be ready to take over. Con should then do the decent thing and die so Art can succeed him, or at least he should let Art get married. So like I said, kingship is cyclical. In day 9, I talked about the story of Kilhuch and Olwen and how Olwen's father, S1e11, is under a similar kind of prophecy. When his daughter Olwen marries, he will die. In fact, her wedding feast and his funeral feast look like they'll be a single event. And that story and the one we're dealing with in this series are two that I can think of. I'm sure there may be others, which spell this out very clearly for us. When the new person is ready to take over, the old person will die. And of course, that brings this situation into very stark relief for us. So naturally, as well as hurling spears at any likely suitor, S1e11 puts 40 impossible tasks, which I'm sure you remember, between his daughter and any likely looking lad. And don't worry, I'm not going to go over the 40 tasks again. But if you think about them, they're actually symptomatic of a kingdom that's going to rack and ruin. Espadadin's fields are unplowed. His store of seeds is scattered. Witches and giants and wild boar are wreaking havoc and causing death and terror in his kingdom. This is not what's supposed to happen if you have a healthy king. And Kilhuch's auntie, in a part of the story I didn't tell, she's the wife of Espadadin's shepherd and kind of not a gatekeeper, but when you enter Espadadin's lands, he's kind of the first guy you meet. And his wife, Kilhuch's auntie, tells how 23 of her sons have been killed by Espadadin. She keeps son number 24 hidden in a chest for his own safety. Espadadin is so afraid of ending his reign that he's killing the young men who should be guarding his wealth for fear one of them might court his daughter. So as for Espadadin's queen, I don't think she's even mentioned as a figure from the past. He should have let go a long time ago. So tomorrow's our last day. I'm about ready for a break, but I've really enjoyed it and I hope you have too. So I hope to see you tomorrow when we'll have a lot of loose ends to tie up. So bye-bye for now.